My name is Joy Macdonell from knitwithjoy.com, and today I'm going to teach you how to make this beautiful cowl. We're going to use our knit and our purl stitches to create this texture that we have at the bottom of the cowl and the top of the cowl. We're going to knit in the round. I'm going to teach you how to connect and join your stitching in the round, and then we're going to play with those knits and purl stitches, creating a little bit of ribbing, then some stockinette stitch, a little garter stitch, moss stitch, and then a quick bind off. You'll be amazed at how quickly you can make this cowl. If you're a beginner knitter, remember it only takes 2 stitches, a knit stitch and a purl stitch. If you haven't done any knitting at all, be sure to take my knitting basics class first. If you've done some knitting but you want to brush up on your skills, visit my knitting review free videos so that you can just brush up on those skills before you get started. We're going to play with those knits and purls and create fun textures in this cowl. So let's get started. When you're knitting, you're creating a fabric. A fabric is made up of your yarn and your needles and your own hands. Everybody knits a little bit differently. Some people knit real tight, some people are a little bit more loose. If I gave the exact same yarn and needles to 3 different people, they would each come up with a different gauge swatch. A gauge is the size of the knit stitch that you're making. So it's very important that you sit down with the yarn and the needle that you've chosen for your project and knit a gauge swatch. This way we can do a measurement to determine exactly the amount of stitches that are in an inch so that we can determine the gauge of the fabric you're creating so that you can create a cowl in the length that you'd like it to be in. My example cowl and the pattern is written for a 25-inch length cowl. If you'd like your cowl to be a different length, if you want it to be longer, to be able to twist it and put it on twice over you, then what you need to do is take your measuring tape and measure how long you would like your cowl to be. In the gauge section, I'm going to teach you how to play with the gauge so that you can create the cowl to be any length you want it to be. You're going to need 115 yards of a bulky weight yarn. I used a size 13 24-inch round knitting needle, a flexible ruler, and a solid ruler, a pair of scissors. You'll need a stitch marker. If you don't have a regular stitch marker, a safety pin will do the trick, along with a piece of string. And then you'll also need a tapestry needle. You will also need the knit check tool. This is a needle gauge tool, and I use it in a couple different ways. The size of the fabric that you're knitting is determined by the width of your yarn and the diameter of the knitting needle that you choose. When you're trying to figure out your gauge, there's going to be a little bit of guesswork that you need to do. So you just have to cast on some stitches and see what size they make. To get my gauge, I went back to my knit check tool and I put my yarn into the different holes just to kind of see what size yarn is this. And I know that these are for knitting needle sizes, but this is how I like to use this tool. I find it very helpful for me. So I put my yarn into the size 8, US needle size 8 hole, and it seemed like it fit really nicely. And I want to go up a few sizes, but not a ton of sizes. So I pulled out a size 13 knitting needle. So I went up 4 sizes and I knit with those 2 things, and that gave me a swatch that I really liked the gauge of. Now when I went to figure out the gauge, what I liked or didn't like, with the size 19 knitting needle, I felt like it was just too open. The stitches were too open and too floppy, and it wasn't going to allow for the cowl to have the drape that I wanted it to have. So I needed to reduce the size of that needle, which would tighten up my stitches just a little bit and create a fabric that's a little bit more dense. And when I did that, I knew that my fabric would be able to drape and sit nicely in the shape of a cowl. Whenever you see somebody else's pattern, you think, I want to make it just like she did. And you can get close. You can get similar yarn and you can get similar colors, but everybody's gauge is just a little bit different depending on how they knit, how tight they hold yarn, or how loose it is. So having a gauge swatch is very important. It's a matter of taking the needles that you're using and the yarn that you're using and making some stitches. And as you stitch a little swatch of fabric, that's going to determine the size of the fabric that you will knit, that will come off the knitting needles to make the piece that you're making. Let's get started knitting your gauge swatch. Now for this project, I chose a size 13 needle and I have my bulky weight yarn. There's no right or wrong to this, and the good news is you're not wasting your yarn. Whatever your gauge, when you knit your swatch and determine your gauge, you can rip it all back out again. So you don't lose anything by doing this, and you're not wasting anything by doing this. You're actually saving yourself a lot of heartache so that you know exactly the size of the fabric you're making when you're knitting. All right, I'm starting with a long tail cast on. If you're not familiar with the long tail cast on, you can go back to the reference library and watch the video on how to do the long tail cast on. But I'm going to cast on about 10 stitches to start my swatch. And I like to add a garter row at the bottom of my swatch just to keep it from rolling. So I'm going to knit about 4 rows to start. Once you've knit 4 rows of garter stitch, then you want to just do stockinette stitch, which means that you knit on the knit side and purl on the purl side. And we'll do that for a couple of inches. So you can see right here, I have my garter stitch rows. These were all knit rows. And then I have the knit rows and the purl rows to make my swatch. And I'm going to go just a little bit further so that I can get a good measurement and a good gauge off of this little swatch that I'm making right here. So now let's put a ruler on this and see how many stitches are in an inch. And if I line up the inch mark with a stitch, and I know that the other one is coming about here. So I'm seeing within an inch I have about 3 stitches. And I kind of like the way that this fabric is shaping up. I like the size of it. I like the way it looks when I get the garter stitch. I think this is how I want my cowl to look. So it's really important to play with your swatch and play with your gauge and play with the size of the knitting needles and the yarn that you have to get the exact size that you want for your fabric that you're making for your cowl. And once you have the gauge the way that you want it, I'm going to show you how to do the math so that you can get the size, the length of the cowl that you want. I know that I want my cowl to be 25 inches in the round, which means that I need to do some math to figure out how many stitches do I need to cast on. I know that I want my cowl to be 25 inches around in circumference. There are 3 stitches per inch. So I want it to be 25 inches, and I need to figure out how many stitches to cast on. So I take 25 and I multiply that by 3, and I get 75. So I'm going to cast on 75 stitches in order to get my cowl to be 25 inches in the round. So let's say that your gauge did not turn out like mine did. I got 3 stitches per inch and you didn't. And let's say that, Joy, your cowl's super cute, but I want mine to be longer and you want the measurement to be different. We have 2 variables that we're working with here. We're working with how many stitches are in the inch and then the length of the actual cowl that you want. So let's do some knitting math. And don't be afraid. I'm going to make this super easy for you. We're going to take the amount of stitches that you got per inch, and we're going to write in the number of stitches over 1 inch. And then next to that, you're going to write your other variable, your measurement. So we have X over the length that you want. Now mine was 25 inches. Let's say you want yours to be 28 inches. You would write in your length right here. Then we're going to do our math. And we're going to multiply 1 times X, which becomes X. And that equals the amount of stitches that you have times the length that you want. When you do that multiplication, X will equal the amount of stitches that you need to cast on to make the cowl in the length that you want. It's not so hard, right? That's easy knitting math. And keep this in mind because you're going to use this ratio over and over and over again throughout your knitting journey. I used 115 yards for my cowl. If you're going to make your cowl larger than I did, make sure you buy extra yarn. Now to figure out how much yardage I need for my long tail cast on, I am going to take my yarn and wrap it 10 times. It's 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 10 times around my needle. And then that will give me a basic idea of how much yarn I need to leave on the tail. So if I measure this, I'm about 12 inches. I had left a bit of a tail as an extra, so I'm about 12 inches a foot for every 10 stitches. Let's just walk through the math real quick to figure out how much we need to leave for our long tail cast on. We have 10 stitches, and that is equal to 12 inches. And we know we're going to have 75 stitches, but we just don't know how much yardage to leave yet. So we'll leave that measurement as X. And then we'll solve our algebra problem here based on X, and you can just fill in the blanks. So here we have 10X equals 900. We'll divide each side by 10, which will solve for X, and that will give us 90 inches. Then I want to convert that into feet. So I'm going to divide by 12, and X equals 7.5 feet. So I'm going to measure out 7.5 feet for how much tail I want to leave for my long tail cast on. So we'll do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7.5. And then I'll start my long tail cast on right here. Now you want to remember, for your long tail cast on, you want to have the ball of yarn to your right and your extra cast on fabric closest to you, your tail closest to you. And I am working with a needle in the round, and I'll show you how to connect your stitching in the round. And I want to go ahead and start by casting on that first stitch. So I'm going to press down, catch down here on the left, come up to the top, and come right down through that triangle. Cast on my first stitch. Now I'm going to go ahead and cast on all 75 stitches. For a full instructional video on how to do the long tail cast on, visit the Knitting Review Library in the Knit with Joy School. Okay, and now that I have all 75 stitches on, the next thing I want to do is add 1 extra stitch for being able to knit in the round and to connect with a nice round connection. You want to make sure that you don't have any of your stitches twisted. So we're going to make sure that all of the stitches are facing in the same direction. You don't want to have anything where you have a twist in your knitting, because if you have that twist, there's no way to fix that problem. You have to rip everything back out and come back down to your start on and then start without a twist. So it's very important here to take the time to make sure that all of your stitches are facing the same way on your knitting needle. So take your time, get your stitches straight, and then we'll go ahead and do our connection in the round. So I'm going to slide these stitches over here to the tip of my needle. And I want to take this stitch, that extra stitch that we put on, and I'm going to slide it onto my left needle, and then I'm going to slide that first stitch up and over that stitch that we just made and give that a little bit of a tightening. Now, this is where you want to add a stitch marker. You may not have a stitch marker that fits exactly over your knitting needles because we have a little bit wider knitting needle. So you can use a safety pin. It's very easy to use and to mark that very first stitch. So I am going to just put this in here and mark that very first stitch. You can also use an extra piece of string to make a stitch marker. So here I have just an extra piece of string. I can just tie, I want to create a loop just by folding the string in half. Then tie a little tie down here towards the bottom. And you can trim this off if you want, or you can leave it long. It's just going to be a marker for your stitching. And then simply put that right here to show that this is the beginning of that round. All right, and then we'll go ahead and get started. Let me get this going in the right direction. This is my tail. Let's do a couple of things. This is my tail. I want to go ahead and put a little, somehow a knot in it, because I want to mark that I don't want to knit with this part of my yarn. I want to work with the part that goes right to the ball. Then we put the stitch marker on. And now what I want to do is just go ahead and knit this first row. So we're going to come into that first stitch and just knit right all the way around. And if that stitch seems a little bit loose and floppy, give that tail a little pull, and that will help straighten that out. And then we'll just go ahead and knit all the way around this first row. Now, as you get towards the end, just look for that stitch marker, because we're going to change up our pattern and do a couple of checks on things. All right, so I'm at my stitch marker. Now, this is an excellent time to just lay down your work and make sure that you didn't get any twists in it. So I'm going to lay this all down and just double check to make sure that I didn't get any twisting on my yarn. Now what you would be looking for, mine looks good. You can see it's all the way around. What you would be looking for is any place that might have a twist or a turn, like this. If you can't straighten that out all the way around from one end to the other, then you have a twist and you need to rip it out and start over. But this is the best time to do that, rather than getting too far into the project. Now I knit on 75 stitches, and I want to do a knit 2, purl 2. I had kind of thought in the beginning I wanted to do a knit 1, purl 1, but I changed my mind and I want to do a knit 2, purl 2. So I need to have an even number of stitches all the way around in order to do that. And I currently have 75 stitches. So I need to add 1 stitch to get an even number of stitches. So what I'm going to do is just move my stitch marker so that I know I'm at the beginning of my round. And I am going to slip this stitch over 1. And then I'm going to reach down here into the bottom of the stitch, the previous stitch, this stitch that's down below. I'm going to reach in and take this left leg right here. I'm going to pick it up, and then I'm going to knit into the back of that stitch. And that will give me an extra stitch, and it won't look really weird, so that I can add that stitch. So if you have an odd number and you realize you want an even number, you can add a stitch very easily that way. Now I want to do a knit 2, purl 2, and I've got 2 knit stitches already on. So I'm simply going to now bring my yarn to the front and do 2 purl stitches. Just like that. Then I'm going to put the yarn to the back and do 2 knit stitches. Then I'm going to bring the yarn to the front again and do 2 purl stitches. Two knit stitches. Two purl stitches. And you want to do this all the way around this whole row, and that is going to set up your pattern. So I'm going to go ahead and knit my pattern, and we'll come back when I'm at the end of it. Okay, now as you're coming around to the end of that first round where you set up your pattern, we have our 2 knit, 2 purl, 2 knit, 2 purl. The thing that you want to check as you're coming around is that you have purl stitches, knit stitches, and then you end the round with purl stitches so that your pattern continues where you have knit stitches. So I'm going to add in my last 2 purl stitches right here. And then I'll slip my marker. And in a pattern, you'll see this noted as SM, which means slip marker. So slip my marker, and then I'm right at that first place where I added that stitch, and it might look like those 2 stitches are super close together. You want to be careful not to knit that as 1 stitch. It actually is 2 separate stitches. So we'll just come in and we'll knit each one. And then you can take a look down here and you can see that that add-in is pretty seamless. Now I'm going to go, this is where you get to be the designer. I'm going to do my knit purl for about this long. Let's see what that means on a ruler. I want to go about 3 inches of knit and purl. So I'm just going to go ahead and continue knitting and purling all the way around until I have about 3 inches of length on my cowl. Okay, so I kind of like this length. I know I had originally said 3 inches for the ribbing, but now that I've gotten this far, I kind of like the idea for 2 inches for the ribbing. So now that I have that set, I'm going to go ahead and start doing a stockinette stitch. And just do stockinette stitch for a little while, and then I'm going to finish the top with a little bit of ribbing. So you can see how that rib stitch turns out, and it looks super cool. It's got a knit 2 and a purl 2, and a knit 2 and a purl 2, and that just gives a little bit of texture right there for the bottom of the cowl, and it'll add some shape and kind of a bottom and a top. Since we're working in the round, when I go to do the stockinette stitch, I'm always working on the same side. So all I have to do is knit every single round. Nothing else but just knit every stitch until I get it to the length that I want it to be. So I'm going to go ahead and knit right over those purl stitches. And just knit all the way around. So here's the cowl, and I've gone ahead and knit about 4.5 inches of stockinette stitch. Then I've added 4 rows of garter stitch, 4 rows of moss stitch, and the bind off. A garter stitch in knitting in the round means that you have to purl a row, knit a row, purl a row, and then knit a row. And you'll get this section right in here where you can see those purl stitches are stacking on top of each other, the knit stitches are in between, and then purl stitches. The moss stitch is right up in this section, and a moss stitch is made up of a knit and a purl and then a knit and then a purl. So you do a row of knitting and purling, then you come back in the next row and you switch. You go to a purl and then a knit. So you're stacking the knit stitch on top of the purl stitch and the purl stitch on top of the knit stitch. And you'll do that for 4 rows and then bind off and your cowl will be finished. So I'm just going to bring my yarn forward and start purling. Okay, here's that first row of purling almost done. Now I'm going to switch back to knitting. So I'll move my marker over and then go ahead and knit for a round. Once you have your purling done, or your knitting, so I've done a row of purl and a row of knit, and now I want to do another row of purl. And this is giving me my garter stitch. So I'm going to slip my marker and I'm going to do another purl row. And a garter stitch just alternates those knit stitches and the purl stitches. So it puts the purl bumps on the front or on the back, but it gives you just a little bit of texture. And that's what I want right here, just a little bit of texture. All right, and now we're going to do the knit stitch again. All right, I'm coming up, this is the end of that knitting row, and I still want this to be a little bit taller, and I like the garter stitch, but I think I want to add a little bit of moss stitch on here too and get this just a little bit taller and still add a little bit more texture. So I'm going to do a moss stitch, which is a knit and a purl. So I'll knit, purl, knit, purl, knit, purl all the way around, and then I'll switch it and I will do the opposite then, a purl and a knit, and that'll give me just a little bit of texture right across the top. So let's go ahead and get that started. I'm going to do a knit, and then a purl, and then a knit, and then a purl. So this is changing the knit and the purl stitches within the row. Instead of just being a solid row of knit or purl, we're doing knitting and purling within the row. And that's going to add just a little bit more texture. Okay, now I'm going to do the opposite, a purl and a knit and a purl and a knit. And that will create a moss stitch, which will add some nice texture. Oops. So I want to go to a purl. So that'll add some nice texture across the top of this cowl. Just by switching up those little stitches, just by changing out where the purls are and where the knits are, you can add some texture. So we're getting some nice effects in here. See that? So the garter stitch, the purl row, the knit row, the purl row, then we have the knit row, then we have the knit and the purl, then you can see the purl is stacked on top of the knit. So then we have the purl and the knit. That'll give us some nice texture to contrast with what happened down here on the bottom, which at the bottom was 2 purls and 2 knits and 2 purls and 2 knits. All right, I think I like how that's turned out. I have my garter stitch and a little bit of moss stitch and my rib stitch down here, and I think now I am ready to do my bind off. All right, so here we have the rib stitch down here at the bottom where we have the knit 2, the purl 2, the knit 2, the stockinette stitch right in this range, and this is about 5 inches long. Then we have the garter stitch. Let's turn this a little bit so that we can look at a section that's not the start and the end. Then the garter stitch where we have our 2 lines, and then some moss stitch right here at the top. And that makes for a pretty fun cowl. And I like the way the measurements are about the same between these two. And now we're ready to do the bind off. So we'll start right here where the marker is and get some of this yarn out. Now the bind off, this is how we take it off the needles and finish the whole project. So I want to do this in a knit fashion. I'm going to do this completely knitting. No purling involved. And you're going to take a knit stitch and 1 more knit stitch, and then you're going to take the stitch in the back. So you just scoop up the stitch in the back of the needle. This is the one that's right in front of the stitch marker, and then you'll bring it up and over that other stitch, and that finishes it off. So you're just going to knit, then come back here to the other one and bring it up and over the previous one. Now when I do that, I give a little pull on the tensioning over here so that it pulls nicely. So we're just going to do the stitch, come back here, pull it up and over, knit, up and over, And you'll see this will start to make a little bit of a hole here where you're finishing off those stitches. Take a stitch, bring the back stitch over the front stitch. Back stitch over the front stitch. And you'll do that all the way down, or all the way around the entire cowl. Okay, and your last stitch just comes right over the first one. And then when you get to the very end, I like to just lift it out a little bit. Lift that thread out. And then you'll go ahead and cut. Pull that thread. And there you go. You can take this marker off. And there it is. And now we just need to weave in the ends and we'll have a beautiful cowl. To weave in the ends, you need a tapestry needle. And you'll just put the yarn over the needle and then thread that needle. And then you want to look for spots where you can hide the end of this yarn right in your project. So oftentimes I'll look for a spot on a purl where I can loop back over a purl stitch, and then I can come back again and just stitch that right down right there over that edge. You just want to thread that right in there. And then once you have that looped in several times, you want to just take that end, and I'm going to look, so you want to be careful as you're looking for your spots. If you just go, oh, I could hide it under there, you want to look back on the other side and see what happens on the other side. So in this case, that would not be a good spot to tuck that in. So I'll just keep going right there underneath my binding. And I want to go kind of far so that that end doesn't come back out. Give it a few pulls like that, and then I can go ahead and trim that end. And then I want to do the same thing down at the bottom. Now this is where we join that round, and you want to look at how nicely that join came together. If you have any gap or anything you need to sew together, just keep that in mind. Now is the time to kind of stitch that down. So we'll thread the needle the same way, yarn right over the needle, up through the eye. And now down here, I'm gonna look for that spot where I might wanna pull something together. It looks pretty good. I don't know that I have a real trouble spot. So I might just go right in over here. If I come over here, I might give myself, let's see what happens. Actually, that's okay. So we'll just keep going right up under this section. Tuck that yarn in under those stitches. If you want to give anything a pull, now is the time. Get that out of the way. Tuck that yarn in there. Weave those ends in. And this is the very end, so you know you're almost done when you're weaving in your ends. So that looks pretty good. I'll go ahead and give that a trim. And it looks like I had a little spot over here where the yarn kind of joined together. So I want to tuck that in. Take a moment now and just give that a little tuck into the rest of the piece. So look for any spots that you might have or any irregularities in your yarn and just tuck that right away. And that's it. There you go. It's all done and ready to wear and ready to enjoy. I really like the way that turned out.